Hi everyone, our topic is allocation of resources. Resources refer to natural resources, but it can also mean hospitals, ventilators, vaccines, and medicines during times of scarcity. Panel 3, however, limits the meaning of resources to money or funds available locally or through international aid or grants. Here, the GDP and PMI were defined in order to gauge and understand the status of the Philippine economy. COVID-19 is both a disaster and a pandemic akin to HIV or AIDS. Both the articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters and the Sunday Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction have attributions to the UN General Assembly. It is a truism that money is the lifeblood of economy. Here's to an effective and efficient plan of a budget. As we all know, the amount initially allocated for government spending is exhausted too soon because of an unexpected occurrence, that is, the COVID-19 crisis. In developing countries such as the Philippines, impact evaluation is vital in identifying what programs or projects work and what do not. It helps policymakers ensure that public and donor funds are used prudently and that limited resources are directed towards more efficient development interventions. With the General Appropriations Act or the national budget, we see that government operations are funded by the personnel services component and the maintenance and other operating expenses. What the government expects to achieve will be undertaken using the capital outlay of its different programs and projects. There are two ways in slicing and distributing the pie of resources: sectoral, meaning in terms of the different sectors of development, or spatial, that which is anchored on area, location, and jurisdiction. What actually guides the administration in coming up with the national budget is the Philippine Development Plan itself. Every 6 years, coinciding with the term of the President and Congress, the government approves a medium-term development plan. The plan outlines what the country intends to do in order for it to develop and progress. The Office of the President, through the Department of Budget and Management, crafts the different allocations per sector and submit the budget to Congress. The COVID-19 pandemic has caught a lot of people, governments, and health agencies by surprise. Like all others, the Philippines needs to plan a budget by dividing the available money at hand for various purposes with a quick policy response or fiscal measures. In a statement, the Philippine Statistics Authority said the country's GDP declined in the first quarter of 2020. Philippine economy shrunk for the first time in over 2 decades amid coronavirus pandemic. According to socioeconomic planning official Carl Kendrick Chua, then, the first quarter is still respectable given the very difficult environment that we are in. The second quarter might be worse, but we are using our policies to proactively manage our trajectory. Investors located here in the Philippines or abroad can use the PMI to their advantage because it is a leading indicator of economic conditions. Unfortunately, during the end of the first quarter of 2020 and the first 2 months of the second quarter, there is contraction, which is not good. For June and July 2020, although there were improvements, there is still a contraction. In the Philippines, some major economic sectors which witnessed reduced business activities include agriculture, forestry, fishing industry, and other services then. Flare up in virus cases in certain parts of US, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Europe could slow or reverse reopening efforts, yet widespread economic shutdowns seem unlikely. These are the main risks that have potential to disrupt or reverse the economic recovery. Any effect on a single country will have an effect in the global economy. According to the World Health Organization, governments, international agencies, and health systems have an obligation to ensure, to the best of their ability, adequate provision of health care for all. However, this may not be possible during a pandemic when health resources are likely to be limited. Setting priorities and rationing resources in this context means making tragic choices, but these tragic choices can be ethically justified. This is why we have ethics. Such choices or decisions may include access to hospitals, ventilators, vaccines, and medicines. It is essential that policies and practices are ethically justified in such contexts. Early on, or in July 2015, the government finalized the National Evaluation Policy Framework through a joint memorandum circular between the National Economic Development Authority and the Department of Budget and Management. This aims to further improve resource allocation processes for various government projects and programs. The intention of an efficient allocation of resources should be needs-based, that is, putting funds where they are greatly needed, such as to help uplift chronically poor citizens or address emergencies caused by both anthropogenic or man-made disasters or natural calamities. The authorities involved should be able to report to us, stakeholders, that the projects that we support achieve the intended outcomes with greater accountability and transparency being institutionalized. The fair allocation of resources is one that is valuable in itself precisely because it is fair. The COVID-19 global crisis, however, reveals that the World Health Organization has limited recourse against uncooperative, non-transparent states. Reforms such as hardening the World Health Organization's soft emergency powers and emphasizing the significance of the legal duty to cooperate are thus imperative. There is a problem because the allocation of countries' wealth depends heavily on politicking, lobbying, or manipulating funds to serve self-interest among those involved. It is true not only within a particular state, but also with entities such as the World Bank. The resulting resource allocation framework may or may not truly respond to the intended purpose. Funds were allocated for the medical sector and for COVID-19 vaccines. This is a representation of the resource allocation scheme. The right side of the framework represents those who stay true to their sworn duties as public officials. The left side represents the informal arrangements made by dishonest politicians. For years, the resource allocation framework has allowed bribery to take place, partly because there are loopholes or flaws in the implementation of the resource allocation scheme. For this reason, the problem should be addressed as a systematic case, not personality based. One person cannot do all those illegal maneuvers without cohorts to make it happen. As the common idiomatic expression says, it takes two to tango. Here are the suggested solutions to the could be resource allocation problem after the COVID 19 crisis. International rules and agreements are the form in which nations usually express their resource arrangements. They indicate how nations deal with these issues now. Social stratification must be avoided. Relief efforts can mean financial aid or monetary grants translated further into a resource. Developing nations recently have urged with some success that developed nations extend substantial amounts of economic assistance to poorer nations. Such help may involve the flow of developed country resources and monies to developing countries as gifts or loans at reduced rates. The ILC articles place the primary responsibility to provide assistance on the affected state. They also require the affected state to seek external assistance when the disaster exceeds its national capacity and prevent affected states from arbitrarily withholding consent to external assistance. However, the ILC articles do not prescribe a duty not to impede relief efforts for non-assisting actors. The voluntary nature of external assistance and that the duty of a state to cooperate does not create a positive obligation to assist. Unless a duty not to impede relief efforts exists in international human rights law, the ILC articles do not prescribe such a supplementary duty. Given the importance of cooperation and external assistance during disaster response, this duty would be a viable option for the future framework of international disaster law. Since international cooperation is vitally important to control the outbreak and to help countries manage the increasing number of cases, the international community has quickly mobilized to provide monetary and technical assistance to the countries affected by COVID 19. However, to provide assistance is not mandatory in nature. International law now recognizes that developed countries at least are obligated to extend economic assistance to developing nations and an extensive body of rules, agreements, institutions, and procedures has been designed to facilitate and regulate assistance efforts. The question really has become not whether developed nations should give, but how much. Even the Sendai framework has a provision relating to sustainable international cooperation. Impediment to relief efforts not only endanger human life and the state targeted by sanctions or other restrictions, but also increase the risk of spreading COVID-19 to other states. The duty not to impede relief efforts as a potential duty under ILC articles is therefore non-derogable. Attribution is the process by which international law establishes whether the conduct of a natural person or any other such intermediary can be considered an act of state and thus be capable of giving rise to state responsibility. Wrongfulness perceived of state acts in allocating resources can be interpreted in two ways. Number one, state to state, and number two, state to its citizens or subjects. If funds were not allocated properly as a positive response for COVID-19, there might be a liability in the international community. Even as international law recognizes the right of a nation to exercise jurisdiction over particular resources, it also can require that such rights be exercised with due respect for international agreements freely entered, the rights of aliens, or the interests of other nations. Besides, a contrasting approach to the international allocation of resources is the principle that resources should not be subject to national sovereignty or jurisdiction, but should, in effect, be common property, accessible to any individual or nation wishing to use them. Here, international obtained funds misused or misappropriated will face consequences depending upon the agreement entered into by and between states. Further, if the misuse or misappropriation as an act of state will be considered a wrongfulness, it might face legal consequences from the international community. We now go to the applicable provisions of the Articles on the Responsibility of State for Internationally Wrongful Acts, or RCWA of 2001, as a customary international law. We have Article 20 on consent. We have Article 21 on self-defense, Article 25 on plea of necessity, Article 29 on continued duty of performance, Article 30 on cessation and non-repetition, Article 31, reparation. Lastly, we have the provision of Article 45 on the loss of the right to invoke responsibility. As a conclusion, Panel 3 says nations must move away from unresolvable debates on ideology and matters of principle to a reasoned dialogue, workmanlike discussions, and good faith bargaining on the very practical questions of a specific and pressing resource and other economic problems. Arrangements should be tailored to solve specific problems, designed to anticipate and avoid, rather than simply to resolve disputes and provide mechanisms for continuing readjustment among the parties as circumstances change. Even when full agreement proves impossible, it may be useful to establish rudimentary arrangements or institutions which bypass unresolvable problems but provide an adaptable and expandable framework for meeting incipient problems. The members of Panel 3 would like to say thank you for bearing with us. Stay safe, everyone.